This is what leads this hour. South Africa recording a massive slump in gross domestic product in the second quarter as COVID-19 took its toll on the economy. The economy contracting by 51% when compared to the second quarter of last year. South Africa's economy suffering a significant contraction during April, May and June. Of course, that was when the country operated under widespread strict lockdown restrictions in response to the spread of COVID-19. It is the fourth consecutive contraction in South Africa's economic growth. The contraction was broad-based, with construction, manufacturing and mining weighing heavy. The only positive contribution of 15.1% coming then from the agricultural sector. Let's have a chat then with Statistician-General Risenga Maluleke, who of course released this data earlier this morning around 11 o'clock. Mr. Maluleke, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. It's certainly data that will prove, as you've noted in the address, that it would definitely be a quarter, reminiscent of just the pandemic. It will be known as the pandemic quarter. The data pointing to some horrible news.
Well, for us as statisticians in official practice, there's no horrible news or difficult news to digest. Any news and any number that can stand the veracity of time with our methods fully defended and explained will always be a number that we can make available to the public. So looking at the slump of 51% of the economy, which is the highest we can ever know in the history of our country. And indeed, if you refer to recent times, only quarter one of 2009, following the global economic meltdown, had reported a negative 6.1% of growth. And this, in terms of real terms, the issue of the size of the economy that we are talking about is equivalent to, that we are talking about in this quarter, the interactions, is equivalent of what happened in 2007. Now, when you look at that, this is the fourth consecutive quarter that we record a negative growth in our economy. But it's not the first time the country has seen this. In the years 1991 to 92, of course, I was still at university, we have seen 8 quarters sustained of negative growth, but the times are different.
They certainly are different. The question also around the collection and collation of this data does come to mind as well, considering that you have had to delay the release of this information. Trusting the veracity of this information, how sure are we that this definitely completes exactly what the situation looked like in that second quarter?
Every quarterly release of the economy by any country is usually subject to revisions. And as you have seen today, when we made the numbers available for this quarter that we are reporting on, that is quarter 2 of 2020, we have also brought revisions of the previous quarter from a negative 2% of a growth to negative 1.8%. But this is the practice, because when you get new data and more refined data, you are able to work on your revisions. Our sources do from time to time give us more data as and when data comes in for that quarter, and we don't disregard that. But in regard to, as regards this quarter that we are reporting on, certainly if we get more data, there will be revisions, but this number has to go out, and we would be the first ones to make it available, not to make it available to the public if we had concerns and worries about it. Certainly there were delays in our regulars, our monthlies, and we have reported them to the public. And of course, the number of estimates, the sample sizes that we are using in terms of response rates, certainly we have seen decline, especially in the space of the lockdown surrounding COVID-19. But we are confident, and we always will make these numbers. Like any other quarterly report we have made available, we will revise if we get new data.
Yeah, you have released with regards to how exactly you are collating this data, considering COVID-19 and its influence on how to collect information. Won't you just share that one more time, perhaps then with our viewers, how exactly this has made things difficult for you, as stats say, with regards to collecting information and data sufficient that we may be able to put out the information?
Firstly, we should make a difference between household surveys and collections that we make and surveys that come from entities like businesses. On the household side, as you will have realized that the quarterly labor force is delayed, is because our field workers could not go out there to go and meet with members of the public in their households. Regarding this one on the GDP, which is a compilation, the GDP is not a survey where we go out to collect. It's a compilation coming out of different sources. Certainly, we have made those monthlies that we needed for the compilation available, albeit delayed. And indeed, we have made indications where the response rates were relatively lower, that we are finding response rates lower, but sufficient enough to publish. Now, one thing we should understand is that even when we were at alert level 5, when the levels were lowered, we were able to go back to leaders of industry, and indeed they have always been cooperative. And our sources like your Department of Minerals and Energy, your Department of Agriculture and the like, to get the source data that we need for purposes of this compilation.
Risenga Maluleke, thank you so much for the time. Truly appreciated there. The Statistician-General then joining us on the line after that horrendous number having just released not so long ago. Of course, South Africa's second quarter GDP number, 51% contraction then for the local economy, the worst in recorded history, at least for the very least since records began in 1960. It certainly is the worst figure on that front. Let's cross on over then to economics editor Thandeka Gqubule-Mbeki, who does join us from our Auckland Park studio. Thandeka, this is certainly a number that everybody will look at and think it is, I suppose, expected, because there were a lot of industries that were in complete shutdown and absolutely closed at 0%. So this number isn't too surprising.
Yes, but it is still momentous, and as you said, it is historic. And it's a moment that will go down in economic history books in South Africa and be analyzed by historians and analysts for many years to come. What they will be looking at is, was it really difficult to anticipate that this would happen? And arguably history will record that it wasn't difficult to anticipate, that it reflected the strict, hard lockdown that South Africa opted for. And indeed, the choice of a hard lockdown will come in for some major review. Of course, it's easy to be wise after the fact and to examine the decisions made by policymakers and government after the fact, but that discussion is worth having for the future. Then also the sufficiency of the stimulus package, which, as you will remember, Arabile, was 10% of GDP and standing at 500 billion. Now, there was debate inside government as to whether to re-stimulate and to issue a secondary stimulus package, but I guess those who argued for the re-stimulation of the economy lost, and that figure is partly, the lack of re-stimulation is reflected in the 51% contraction on our GDP figure. Thirdly, the social dislocation is going to be difficult to imagine and quite difficult to contemplate the agony in those households, the businesses that have collapsed, the liquidation figures. It will be like images from the Great Depression, where citizens walk around the streets with their possessions. And it would then bode the question, will our society be viable post this kind of figure, and how are we going to recover? Now, Arabile, the president, is set to announce very soon an economic recovery plan, but we must imagine that the figures that Mr. Maluleke will come back perhaps next week or sometime in September to tell us about the joblessness figures. The household survey will be ready by then, and it will indicate a jobs bloodbath. Will our society be able to resist this kind of devastation? Will we be able as a country to rise like a phoenix from the ashes?
Yes, rising from the ashes, though, as you noted, will depend quite heavily on that stimulus package. As you noted, it didn't necessarily work in the first 3 months. Perhaps some detractors will say, let's give it some time and perhaps some time to work into the system. But one would also say that it wasn't necessarily a stimulus package, Thandeka. These were really just measures to give out loans to businesses. We aren't necessarily really stimulating the economy now, are we?
Now, you are bang on the money, because we interviewed Professor Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winning economist, who took issue with the structure of the stimulus, particularly the 200 billion loan guarantee scheme that went to the banks, and then the banks then applied their normal lending measures and practices to this 200 billion, and those are very exclusionary. And there were problems with the stimulus money seeping through to the people for whom it was designed. And there were problems with the stimulus package design in general, not to mention the amount of corruption that went into depleting resources meant to cushion this economy and the poor communities in particular.
Yeah, luckily for us, it is a task of reviewing what has been done by policymakers. From here on, how difficult a task is it to raise South Africa, as you noted, from the ashes like a phoenix?
It will be a mammoth task. It will be a test of leadership. It will be a test of grit. And the scarring and the permanent scarring that is existing in our society, in our body politics, and in our social life, we will be paying for this moment for many years to come. But if the society decides on the route of re-stimulating and gives clear policy guidelines going forward, as did President Teddy Roosevelt of the American people when he was trying to yank them out of the economic gloom of the Great Depression. He came up with the Alphabet program, which included major infrastructure, public works, job creation, as well as massive education and social programs. And he created agencies for that. And I think that the president will be moving very much along those lines, but he will need the goodwill of society. As for us, we will be doing our public service broadcasting duty and our mandate to bring you all aspects to those debates and reflecting the views of citizens as to how South Africa will revive itself.
If only we'd rid ourselves of the corruption that continues to plague the country, some of these methodologies may actually work at some point. Economics editor Thandeka Gqubule-Mbeki, thank you so much for the time. Appreciated this afternoon. Of course, that breaking news figure, of course, horrendous indeed. 51% contraction when it comes to South Africa's economy for the second quarter, the worst data on record.